They called her the Ghost.
For 2 years, Alara Vance had drifted through the fluorescent-lit corridors of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital, a silent figure in slightly too large, faded blue scrubs. She was the foreign nurse with the unplaceable Eastern European accent, the one who never spoke unless spoken to, who did the jobs no one else wanted. She cleaned up messes others made, restocked supply closets without being asked, and held the hands of dying patients when the other staff were too busy. They didn't know that the slight, almost imperceptible limp in her right leg wasn't from a clumsy fall, but from the mangled fuselage of a C-130 Hercules over the Hindu Kush. They didn't know that the network of faint, silvery scars on her forearms, usually hidden by her long sleeves, weren't from a kitchen accident, but from shrapnel and desperate, self-administered stitches in the dark. They didn't expect that the quiet woman they mocked for her meekness could command a room with the force of a thunderclap. Alara Vance wasn't just a nurse. She was a weapon, forged in the crucible of war, and they had absolutely no idea the storm that was about to break. The air in the St. Jude's emergency department was a familiar, suffocating cocktail of antiseptic, stale coffee, and human misery. It was a Tuesday, which meant it was Dr. Adrian Thorne's day to reign. Dr. Thorne was handsome in the way of expensive watches and inherited confidence. His teeth were too white, his black hair perfectly coiffed, and his pristine white coat seemed to repel the very chaos of the ER. He moved through the department not as a healer, but as a king surveying his fiefdom. His authority was absolute, built on a foundation of a prestigious medical degree, a powerful family name, and a booming voice that could make interns flinch from 20 feet away. Today, that voice was aimed, as it so often was, at Alara. "Ghost, my coffee," he barked, not bothering to look up from the chart he was pretending to read. He didn't use a name, just the cruel nickname the staff had adopted. It was born from her habit of appearing silently where she was needed, a spectral presence that was both useful and, to them, unnerving. Alara, who had been meticulously checking the seals on the sterile dressing packs in Trauma Bay 1, simply nodded and moved towards the staff break room. She didn't hurry. She didn't dawdle. Her movements were economical, efficient, devoid of any wasted energy. It was a habit beaten into her by years where a single misstep could mean the difference between life and death. Here, it just made her seem odd, detached. She returned with a steaming mug, placing it on a clean patch of the nurse's station counter. Thorne picked it up, took a sip, and made a face of theatrical disgust. "Is it so difficult to make a simple cup of coffee? This tastes like battery acid. Are you even qualified to operate a Keurig?" A few of the younger nurses, sycophants who orbited Thorne like nervous moons, tittered nervously. Brenda, a senior nurse with a perpetually sour expression, smirked. "Give her a break, doctor. She's probably used to drinking mud." Alara's face remained a placid mask. Inside, she catalogued the insult along with the hundreds of others. It wasn't anger she felt, not anymore. It was a cold, heavy resignation. She thought of the coffee she was used to, a bitter, gritty sludge boiled over a hexamine stove in a freezing Afghan dawn, shared with men whose names were now etched on a granite wall in Virginia. This clean, hot, terrible coffee was a luxury beyond their wildest dreams. She simply inclined her head. "I will make another, doctor." "Don't bother," Thorne snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "Just go make yourself useful. Polish the defibrillators or something." He turned his back on her, the dismissal absolute. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell on a patient being wheeled in, a young man, pale and sweating from a suspected kidney stone. The intern, a nervous first-year named Ben, was struggling to place an IV line. The patient's veins were rolling, and he was starting to get agitated. "I can't get it," Ben stammered, pulling the needle back. Thorne sighed dramatically. "For heaven's sake, it's a simple IV, not brain surgery. Let me." He shouldered the intern aside, grabbed a new catheter, and promptly blew the vein, causing a dark hematoma to blossom under the patient's skin. The man cried out in pain. Thorne cursed under his breath, throwing the needle onto the tray with a clatter. "He's a difficult stick, dehydrated." He looked around, his eyes landing on Alara. "Ghost, you. Hold his arm, and try not to pass out from the sight of blood." Alara moved to the bedside. She ignored the insult. She ignored Thorne's frustrated glare. She took the patient's arm in her hands, her touch surprisingly firm and steady. Her fingers gently palpated the skin, not where Thorne and the intern had been jabbing, but further down, along the ulnar side of the forearm. With the thumb of her other hand, she applied pressure in a specific way, anchoring the tissue. "Try here," she said, her voice a low murmur, meant only for the intern, Ben. She indicated a spot that looked unremarkable to the untrained eye. "Use a shallower angle. The vessel is superficial." Ben, desperate, wiped his sweaty palms on his scrubs and nodded. He took a fresh needle, followed her precise instructions, and slid the catheter in perfectly. A dark flash of red appeared in the chamber. Success. "I got it," he breathed, a wave of relief washing over his face. Thorne, who had been distracted by a text on his phone, looked up. "See? A little confidence is all it takes. Good job, Ben. You're learning from me." He clapped the intern on the back, taking full credit. He didn't notice the look Ben shot at Alara, a look of pure, unadulterated gratitude and awe. Alara simply let go of the patient's arm and faded back into the shadows of the hallway, her job done. No one saw the ghost of a smile on her lips. It wasn't a smile of warmth. It was a smile of cold, hard certainty. A smile that knew that credentials and confidence were nothing. Competence was everything. And in this place, competence was in dangerously short supply. The afternoon bled into evening, marked by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. The ER was in a deceptive lull, the calm before the inevitable storm of Friday night drunks and weekend accidents. Dr. Thorne was holding court, leaning against the main desk, telling a story to his usual audience of Brenda and two other nurses. His voice, meant to be charming, was a loud, arrogant drone that filled the space. He was recounting a recent, minor surgical success, embellishing every detail until it sounded as though he had single-handedly cured cancer. And the chief of surgery, old man Hemlock himself, he comes to me afterwards and says, "Adrian, that was the finest bit of suturing I've seen in 20 years. 20 years, he boomed, spreading his hands wide. Brenda nodded enthusiastically, her expression one of rapt adoration. The other nurses giggled. Alara was in the background, quietly running a diagnostic on the portable ultrasound machine. The fast scan probe felt familiar in her hand, a cold, smooth weight. She remembered holding one just like it, its screen flickering in the green glow of night vision goggles as she pressed it to the taut abdomen of a soldier, searching for the dark bloom of internal bleeding. The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the metallic tang of blood and the dry, dusty air. A voice from the past echoed in her mind, a young medic's frantic shout over the roar of rotor blades. "Colonel, I can't find the bleed. He's going into shock." Her own voice, younger then, but just as calm, had cut through the panic. "Quiet, son. Give me the probe. Let the machine see for you." "Ghost, are you deaf?" Thorne's voice shattered the memory. She blinked, the dusty landscape of Afghanistan dissolving back into the sterile white of St. Jude's. Thorne was glaring at her, his perfect face twisted in irritation. "I asked you a question." "I apologize, Doctor, I did not hear," she said, her voice flat. "I'm sure you didn't," he sneered. "I was just telling everyone about the importance of pedigree, of training. People think any idiot can be a doctor or a nurse, but it's about where you come from. Harvard, Johns Hopkins, not some backwater diploma mill in wherever it is you're from." He waved a vague hand eastward. "It matters." A new patient was being wheeled in, an elderly woman clutching her chest, her face the color of ash. A classic MI. The team snapped into action, but Thorne remained fixated on his audience, on his lesson. He pointed a finger at Alara. "You see, when a patient is crashing, you don't want someone who learned medicine from a textbook translated into whatever language they speak. You want the best. You want me." The elderly woman on the gurney let out a low moan. The monitor attached to her was already showing dangerous ST segment elevation. Young Ben, the intern, was trying to get her medical history from her wheezing gasps. "Ma'am, are you on any blood thinners? Aspirin? Plavix?" Alara's eyes were locked on the monitor. She saw the specific pattern of the arrhythmia, the subtle dip in the QRS complex that preceded a full ventricular fibrillation. It was a pattern she had seen dozens of times before, a deadly signature. She knew they had seconds, not minutes. She moved forward, her hand reaching for the drawer containing the amiodarone. "What do you think you're doing?" Brenda hissed, stepping in her way. "The doctor hasn't given orders yet." "She is going into V-fib," Alara stated quietly, her eyes still on the monitor. "She needs amiodarone, 300 milligrams, now." Thorne finally turned his attention to the patient, annoyed at the interruption to his monologue. He glanced at the monitor. "It's just a few PVCs. She's anxious. Give her a little Ativan to calm her down." He was looking at the screen, but he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing what he expected to see. "Doctor, that is not a PVC," Alara insisted, her voice gaining a sharp edge of urgency that was entirely new. "The morphology is changing. Look." Just as she spoke, the orderly rhythm on the monitor devolved into a chaotic, useless scribble. V-fib. The alarm blared, a shrill, piercing scream. The woman's eyes rolled back in her head. She was in cardiac arrest. "Damn it!" Thorne shouted, suddenly panicked. "Crash cart! Start compressions!" Ben, his face white with fear, jumped onto the step stool and began the rhythmic, brutal work of CPR. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Thorne fumbled with the defibrillator paddles, his hands shaking slightly. "Charge to 200, he yelled. Alara was already there, ripping open the woman's gown, exposing her chest. She had the saline pads ready. Thorne slammed the paddles down. "Clear!" The woman's body jumped on the gurney, a grotesque spasm. The monitor showed the chaotic rhythm persisting. "It's not working!" Brenda cried. "Charge to 300, Thorne commanded, his voice strained. Alara looked from the monitor to Thorne's panicked face. He was flailing. He was going to kill this woman. Without a word, she reached past him and drew up the amiodarone she had pointed to moments before. She found the IV line Ben had expertly placed and pushed the drug fast. "Drug in," she said, her voice clear and steady in the chaos. "I didn't order that," Thorne screamed at her, his face purpling with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Saving her life," Alara said, her gaze unwavering. "Charge again. 360. This time, Thorne was too stunned to argue. He charged the machine. "Clear." Another jump. They all held their breath, staring at the monitor. The chaotic scribble wavered, then resolved. A beat. Another. A slow, steady sinus rhythm appeared on the screen. The most beautiful sight in the world. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Ben nearly collapsed off the stool. Thorne stood there, paddles in hand, breathing heavily. He looked from the stable monitor to Alara, and the rage returned, tenfold. He was humiliated. She had been right. She, the ghost, had shown him up in his own ER. His eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. He would make her pay for this. The relative quiet that followed the successful resuscitation was thick with unspoken tension. Dr. Thorne hadn't said another word to Alara, but the fury radiating from him was a palpable force. He stalked around the ER, snapping at interns and slamming drawers, a man whose pristine image had been publicly tarnished. He was waiting for his moment. It came an hour later, during a visit from two members of the hospital's board of directors, who were conducting a tour with the hospital administrator. They were wealthy, important-looking people, a man and a woman in tailored suits that cost more than Alara's monthly salary. Dr. Thorne, ever the opportunist, intercepted them near the trauma bays, his charming smile plastered back on his face. He was explaining the cutting-edge technology, the high success rates, the general excellence of his department. And of course, our greatest asset is our highly trained and disciplined staff, he said, his voice smooth as silk. His eyes scanned the room, and with a predator's instinct, landed on Alara, who was quietly wiping down the crash cart, replacing the used supplies. "We insist on the highest standards of professionalism." He led the small, smiling procession over to where she was working. "This, for example, is one of our support staff," he began, his tone condescending. The administrator and the board members smiled politely at Alara. "While we value everyone's contribution, we also have a very strict chain of command. Protocols are in place for a reason. They ensure patient safety." He turned to Alara, his smile turning sharp and cruel. "Isn't that right, nurse?" He didn't use her nickname, not in front of the board. He used her title like a weapon. "Tell the board why it's so important to follow a doctor's orders without question." The room seemed to fall silent. Everyone within earshot, Ben, Brenda, the other nurses, froze. This was a public execution. Alara slowly straightened up, her hands still. She looked at the expectant faces of the board members, at the nervous glance from the administrator, and finally at Dr. Thorne's smug, triumphant face. "In a clear and stable situation," Alara said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden hush, "the chain of command provides order." Her accent seemed a little thicker, her words chosen with deliberate care. "Exactly," Thorne boomed. "Order." "But," she continued, holding his gaze, "when a patient is actively dying due to a misdiagnosis, the primary protocol is not obedience. It is to save the life." The air seemed to change. It was no longer a simple reprimand. It was a confrontation. The board members' polite smiles faltered. "Doctor." Thorne's face began to lose its color. "That is an outrageous and insubordinate accusation," he hissed, keeping his voice low but intense. "Earlier today," Alara stated, her voice devoid of emotion. A patient presented in cardiac distress. You diagnosed anxiety. I identified impending ventricular fibrillation. You ordered a sedative. I prepared the antiarrhythmic. The patient arrested. My intervention, which you expressly forbade, was instrumental in achieving return of spontaneous circulation. These are not accusations, doctor. They are the recorded facts of the event. A gasp came from one of the younger nurses. Ben, who had been trying to make himself invisible behind a supply cart, looked like he was going to be sick. Brenda's face was a mask of disbelief and fury on Thorne's behalf.
The male board member cleared his throat,
Looking deeply uncomfortable. Adrian, he said, his tone shifting from friendly to concerned. Is this true? She's a disgruntled foreign employee, Thorne sputtered, his composure finally cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. She's confused. She overstepped her bounds, and I was about to reprimand her when you arrived. She has no idea what she's talking about. Look at her. Does she look like someone whose medical opinion you would trust over a board-certified cardiologist from Harvard? He gestured at her faded scrubs, her worn-out running shoes, her quiet, unassuming posture. The contrast with his tailored suit and expensive Italian leather shoes was stark. He was betting on their inherent prejudice, on their trust in appearances and credentials. For a long moment, it seemed to work. The board members looked from Thorne to Alara and back again. They saw a powerful, connected doctor and a lowly, foreign nurse.
Their expressions were clouded with doubt.
But Alara didn't flinch. She didn't defend herself further. She simply stood there, a silent testament to her own statement, letting his frantic, sputtering defense hang in the air. Her quiet dignity was more powerful than his loud panic. The hospital administrator, a man named Henderson, who was skilled at navigating treacherous political waters, stepped forward. Perhaps, he said smoothly, trying to de-escalate, we should review the incident report and the chart in my office, Adrian. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Thorne, seeing an escape, seized it. Yes, an excellent idea. A simple misunderstanding. He shot one last look at Alara, a look that promised retribution, a cold, dark promise of professional ruin. As he turned to lead the group away, a young nurse, Chloe, who had started only a few months prior, caught Alara's eye. Chloe had watched the whole exchange with wide, terrified eyes.
Now she gave Alara
A tiny, almost imperceptible nod of support. It was a small gesture, a flicker of solidarity in a hostile sea, but for the first time that day, Alara felt a sliver of something other than cold resignation. It was the faintest spark of warmth, but it was there. The storm broke just after 9 p.m., not the metaphorical storm of Dr. Thorne's brewing vengeance, but a literal one. A furious late-autumn squall swept in from the coast, lashing the city with horizontal rain and violent gusts of wind. The lights in the ER flickered twice, making everyone's hearts skip a beat before the hospital's powerful backup generators kicked in with a low, reassuring hum. The wail of sirens began to cut through the howl of the wind, first one, then two, then a cascade of them, a chorus of disaster converging on their location. A red phone on the wall, a direct line for mass casualty incidents, shrieked. Brenda snatched it up. Her face went pale as she listened. "Oh my God," she whispered.
She looked at Thorne,
her eyes wide. Bridge collapse, the I-5 connector over the industrial canal, the storm, the wind shear. They're saying a whole section just went down. The ER, which had been tense, exploded. It was organized chaos. Dr. Thorne, his earlier humiliation forgotten in the rush of adrenaline and the chance to be a hero, was in his element. "All right, listen up," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "I want trauma bays 1 through 4 prepped and ready. Chloe, Ben, you're on triage at the ambulance bay. I want green tags in the waiting room, yellows in the hallway beds, and reds straight to me. Brenda, coordinate with the blood bank. We're going to need everything they've got. Move, move, move!" Staff scrambled, their training kicking in. Carts were rolled, supplies were grabbed, sterile fields were laid out. The air crackled with energy and dread. Elara moved with the rest of them, but her focus was different.
She wasn't just stocking supplies.
She was calculating. She was mentally inventorying the most critical items. Chest tubes in all sizes, IO drills, tourniquets, pericardial centesis trays. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of triage and trauma management, was already on the bridge. She pictured the twisted metal, the crushed cars, the brutal physics of the fall. She knew the kinds of injuries they were about to see. Polytrauma, crush injuries, hypothermia from the cold canal water. She grabbed a stack of thermal blankets, a move no one else had thought of yet. The first ambulance screamed up to the bay doors. Ben and Chloe, looking terrified but determined, met it. The doors flew open. "Green tag!" the paramedic yelled. A man with a broken arm and a laceration on his forehead, walking but dazed. Chloe expertly tagged him and pointed him toward the waiting room. The next ambulance was right behind it, and the next. Soon, the ER was a river of human suffering. The floor grew slick with rainwater and blood. The sounds of beeping, shouting, and crying merged into a single, overwhelming roar. Thorne was in Trauma Bay, one with the first critical patient, a woman with massive abdominal injuries. He was barking orders, calling for scans, loving the spotlight. "People, this is what we train for," he shouted to anyone listening. "This is where St. Jude's proves why it's the best." Then the call came over the radio that changed everything. A paramedic, his voice strained over the static, was reporting from the scene. "Dispatch, we have a priority 1 patient, extricated from a submerged vehicle. Looks like a government car, black sedan. Male, approximately 60s, unconscious. Massive thoracic trauma. We've got an impalement. Rebar through the right chest. Vitals are crashing. ETA to St. Jude's is 2 minutes." There was a pause. Then the paramedic's voice dropped. "Be advised, the vehicle had government plates."
This might be a VVIP.
A hush fell over the central desk. A VVIP. That meant scrutiny. That meant no mistakes. All eyes turned to Dr. Thorne. This was his moment. He puffed out his chest. "Bring him to me. Trauma Bay 2. Get the OR on standby. I want a full cardiothoracic team ready to go. And somebody get Henderson from administration down here now." He was already thinking about the press conference, about the commendations. Elara heard the report, and a cold dread settled in her stomach. Impalement. Thoracic. Submerged vehicle. That meant hypothermia, contaminated wound, and a high probability of a tension pneumothorax, or, even worse, cardiac tamponade from the object shifting. This was not a textbook injury. This required a specific, delicate, and brutal kind of expertise. She looked at Dr. Thorne, who was preening for the administrator, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that he did not possess it. The patient had 2 minutes to live, and he was being brought to the wrong man.
She grabbed a full chest tube tray
And an 18-gauge angiocath, and began moving silently towards Trauma Bay 2. She was no longer a ghost. She was a soldier, moving toward the sound of the guns. The doors to Trauma Bay 2 burst open with violent force. Two paramedics, their faces grim and rain-soaked, shoved a gurney into the room. On it lay the VVIP. He was a man in his 60s, his face pale and blue-tinged, his expensive suit shredded and soaked with a mixture of dark water and brighter red blood. Protruding from the right side of his chest, just below the clavicle, was a 2-foot length of rust-colored rebar. It rose from his body like a grotesque monument, moving slightly with every jostle of the gurney. Male, 65, impaled with rebar, extricated from a submerged vehicle. The lead paramedic rattled off, his voice breathless. GCS of 3, BP is 70 over palp, heart rate 140 and thready. We started a wide-open crystalloid drip, but he's not responding. Doctor. Thorne swept into the room, a flurry of white-coated importance. All right, get him on the monitor. Let's get a cross-match for 10 units of O-neg. I need a chest X-ray, stat. Let's get a fast scan on his belly. He was barking orders, a checklist of procedures for a standard trauma, but his eyes kept flicking nervously to the piece of metal sticking out of the man's chest. He was avoiding the real problem. Alara slipped into the room, unnoticed in the chaos. She stood near the foot of the bed, her eyes missing nothing. She didn't look at the rebar itself. She looked at the patient. She saw the dangerously low blood pressure. She saw the rapid, shallow breathing. But most importantly, she saw two things Thorne had missed entirely. The patient's neck veins were massively distended, bulging like thick ropes, and when the nurse placed the stethoscope on his chest, far from the injury, the heart sounds were muffled, distant, like a drum beating under a pile of blankets. Distended jugular veins, muffled heart sounds, hypotension, Beck's triad. It wasn't a pneumothorax from a punctured lung. The rebar had gone deeper. It had grazed the pericardium, the sac around the heart, and now that sac was filling with blood. Cardiac tamponade. The heart was being strangled, unable to pump. They didn't have minutes. They had seconds. Dr. Thorne, Alara said, her voice cutting through the noise. It was quiet, yet it commanded attention. Thorne shot her an irritated look. What is it? Can't you see I'm busy saving this man's life? Go get me those blood products. The X-ray will be too slow, she said, ignoring his order. He doesn't have a pneumothorax, he has a tamponade. The rebar has perforated the pericardium. Thorne actually laughed, a short, incredulous bark. A tamponade? Based on what? Your voodoo intuition? I'm the cardiologist here, nurse. I think I can recognize a simple tension pneumothorax. He turned to Brenda. Get me a chest tube kit.
We're putting a tube in his left side to be safe.
Putting a chest tube in the wrong side of a patient who didn't need one would do nothing. It was a fatal waste of time. The patient's blood pressure on the monitor dipped further. 60 over palp. The alarm began to beep, a frantic, high-pitched rhythm. Sir, there is no time, Alara said, her voice losing its deferential tone and gaining a hard, steel edge. You need to perform a pericardiocentesis, now, or he will be dead in the next 60 seconds. Get her out of my trauma bay, Thorne roared, his face flushed with fury and panic. He was losing control. Security! Get this woman out of here. She's interfering with patient care. Brenda moved to grab Alara's arm, but Alara sidestepped her with a fluid motion that was shockingly fast. The patient on the gurney let out a final, shuddering gasp. The line on the heart monitor went flat. A single, continuous, soul-shattering tone filled the room. He was dead. You see! Thorne screamed, his voice cracking. You distracted me! You killed him! Alara didn't look at Thorne. She didn't look at the other stunned faces in the room. She looked at the flat line on the monitor, and she acted. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She wasn't the ghost. She was Colonel Vance, and this was her field of operations. "No," she said, her voice a low command. "Not yet." In one swift movement, she grabbed the portable ultrasound machine she had wheeled in with her. She slammed the probe onto the man's chest, her eyes locked on the small screen. "There," she whispered. She saw it. The heart, motionless, surrounded by a black sea of blood in the pericardial sac. She then snatched the 18-gauge angiocath, a long, thick needle, from the tray she had prepared. "What are you doing? Stop her!" Thorne shrieked. Alara ignored him. She took the needle, aimed for the subxiphoid space just below the sternum. It was a blind procedure, incredibly dangerous, but her mind was a three-dimensional map of the human torso. She knew the angle, she knew the depth. She pushed the needle in, her hand rock steady. She aspirated with the attached syringe. Nothing. She advanced another centimeter. She felt the subtle pop as the needle pierced the pericardial sac. She pulled back on the plunger. Dark, non-clotting blood filled the syringe. She pulled 20 cubic centimeters of blood out of the sac. On the ultrasound screen, the black sea receded slightly. The heart, freed from the immense pressure, gave a single, spastic twitch. Then another. On the main monitor, the flat line broke. A single, weak QRS complex appeared. Then another. A slow, agonizingly weak rhythm returned. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the slow, steady beep of the restored heartbeat. Everyone, Thorne, Brenda, the paramedics, the interns, stared, their jaws slack, their minds unable to process what they had just witnessed. A foreign nurse, with a single needle and an act of shocking defiance, had just brought a dead man back to life. Dr. Thorne stood frozen for a beat, his face a canvas of shock, fury, and raw humiliation. The steady beep of the cardiac monitor was a mocking confirmation of his failure and her impossible success. His authority, his entire world, had been shattered in 30 seconds by the woman he called the Ghost. He couldn't let it stand. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, desperate rage. "Security!" he screamed, his voice shrill and ugly. "I want her arrested, now! That was assault. She performed an unauthorized procedure on my patient. She could have killed him." He was trying to reclaim the narrative, to twist her life-saving action into a criminal offense. 2 hospital security guards, drawn by the earlier commotion, stepped hesitantly into the room. They were big men, used to dealing with drunks and distraught family members. Not this. They looked from Thorne's apoplectic face to the calm, steady woman standing over the patient, a bloody syringe still in her hand. They looked at the monitor, which was clearly showing a living patient. They were confused. "Sir," one of the guards began, he's alive." "I don't care. It was luck. She violated every protocol in the book. Cuff her." Thorne jabbed a trembling finger at Alara. Alara didn't even look at him. Her attention was solely on the patient. The pericardiocentesis was a temporary fix, a stopgap. The sac would fill with blood again. "His pressure is still too low," she said, her voice crisp and clinical, as if Thorne wasn't even in the room. "The tamponade is recurring. He needs a clamshell thoracotomy. We need to open his chest, relieve the pressure, and find the bleeder. Now." "A clamshell? Here? In the ER?" Brenda gasped. That's barbaric.
We don't do that."
It was a brutal, last-ditch procedure, usually reserved for the battlefield, where a surgeon literally cracks open the chest cavity. "We do it today," Elara stated. She turned to the terrified intern, Ben. "Get me a number 10 scalpel, a jiggly saw, and the largest rib spreaders you can find. Move." Ben, caught between the screaming Dr. Thorne and the terrifying competence of this new Elara, hesitated for a second, then scrambled to obey her. Her certainty was more compelling than Thorne's rage. "Don't you dare touch him!" Thorne shrieked, lunging forward to physically stop her. He never made it. As he reached for her, a sound began to permeate the ER. It started as a low thumping, a vibration felt more than heard, rapidly growing louder. Whoomp, 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 whoomp. It was the sound of heavy rotor blades beating the storm-tossed air into submission. It was impossibly loud, shaking the windows in their frames, rattling instruments on their trays. It wasn't a news chopper or a police bird. The sound was too deep, too powerful. It was military. Every head in the ER turned toward the windows facing the ambulance bay. Through the driving rain, they could see it, a massive, dark shape descending towards the hospital's helipad, its landing lights cutting brilliant, strobing cones through the downpour. It was a Sikorsky HH-60 Pavehawk, the kind used by Air Force pararescue teams, painted a menacing, matte black. As this impossible sight held everyone captive, a voice, calm and laced with digital static, crackled over the ER's main communication radio, which a nurse had left on. The voice was pure military cadence, devoid of any panic. "St. Jude's Tower, this is Navy Rescue 1, on final approach to your pad. We are executing a Priority 1 medevac under military authority. Be advised, we are coming for a Priority 1 evac. We require Colonel Vance to be standing by. I repeat, we are coming for Colonel Vance." A profound, deafening silence fell over the entire emergency department. Every single person, from the administrator who had just scurried in, to the interns, to Brenda, to the security guards, stopped dead. The shouting, the chaos, the medical drama, it all evaporated. There was only the sound of the Pavehawk's thundering blades and that one impossible sentence hanging in the air. Dr. Thorne froze mid-lunge, his arm outstretched. His face, which had been red with rage, drained of all color. He slowly turned his head from Elara to the radio, then back to Elara. His mind stuttered, unable to connect the words he had just heard with the woman standing before him. Colonel Vance. He looked at the quiet foreign nurse he had tormented for 2 years. The ghost. And for the first time, he felt a sliver of something he hadn't experienced since medical school. Pure, undiluted fear. The backwash from the Pavehawk's rotors blasted the ambulance bay, sending a hurricane of wind and rain against the glass doors. The sheer power of the machine was terrifying. The sliding doors of the ER hissed open, and the storm momentarily invaded the sterile space, whipping papers off counters and making scrubs flap. Into this maelstrom stepped 3 figures. They didn't belong in a hospital. They belonged on a battlefield. 2 of them were pararescue jumpers, or PJs, clad in full tactical gear, helmets with night vision mounts, and vests laden with medical equipment and magazines. They moved with a lethal economy, their eyes scanning the room, assessing every person as a potential threat. Between them walked a man who seemed to command the very air around him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, in his late 60s, but radiating a vitality that shamed men half his age. He wore the crisp, decorated Class A uniform of a 4-star general of the United States Army. His chest, a formidable constellation of ribbons and medals. His face was a granite mask of authority, etched with lines of command. This was General Marcus Thorne. The hospital administrator Henderson scurried forward, his face a mixture of awe and terror. "General, I'm Director Henderson. We weren't expecting you. Is there something?" General Thorne's cold grey eyes swept past him as if he were a piece of furniture. He ignored the outstretched hand. His gaze swept the chaotic room, taking in the blood, the terrified staff, the patient on the gurney, and the tableau of confrontation around him. He ignored Dr. Adrian Thorne, who stood frozen like a statue, his face a ghastly shade of white. The general's eyes searched, and then they found her. They landed on Alara. The hard mask of his face softened, just for a fraction of a second, with profound relief. "Valkyrie," he said. The name was a low, gravelly rumble, but it cut through every other sound in the room. It wasn't a question, it was a recognition. Alara met his gaze. For the first time, the weary, haunted look in her eyes was replaced by something else. The sharp, focused alertness of a commander greeting her superior. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "General," she acknowledged, her voice steady. "It's good to see you, Colonel," he said, striding forward. The PJs flanked him, clearing a path through the gawking staff as if they were parting water. He stopped beside the gurney, his eyes taking in the rebar, the monitor, the bloody syringe still on the tray. He looked at the patient's face, and a flicker of personal pain crossed his own. "Secretary Davenport," he murmured. "Damn it." He looked back at Alara. "Report." The shift in her was instantaneous and absolute. The meek, quiet nurse was gone. In her place stood an officer. "Sir, patient is Secretary of Defense Robert Davenport. Impalement via rebar, right upper thorax. Presented with Beck's triad, progressing to PEA arrest. I performed an emergent pericardiocentesis, aspirating 20 cubic centimeters of blood, achieving ROSC. He's hemodynamically unstable. Tamponade is recurring. He needs a clamshell thoracotomy and direct cardiac repair." Her report was a burst of concise technical information delivered with the rapid-fire precision of a military briefing. The staff of St. Jude's stared, utterly dumbfounded. They didn't just not understand the words, they didn't understand the woman speaking them. General Thorne nodded, his expression grim. "The best trauma surgeon in the country is on board the Pavehawk. We need to get him out of here." He turned to his PJs. "Package him up. Let's move." It was then that Dr. Adrian Thorne finally found his voice. It was a weak, stammering thing. Uncle Marcus?" The general turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon his nephew for the first time. The coldness that entered his eyes was absolute. It was a look of such profound disappointment and contempt that Adrian physically flinched. "Don't you dare call me that," the general bit out, each word a chip of ice. "Not here. Not now." But she," Adrian stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Alara. "She's just a nurse. She assaulted the secretary. I was in control. She interfered." The general took a slow, deliberate step toward his nephew. He was several inches taller and seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. "She is Colonel Alara Vance," he said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "For 6 years, she was the lead combat surgeon for the Joint Special Operations Command's clandestine medical unit. They call her Valkyrie because she's the one they send into hell to pluck heroes from the jaws of death. The Medal of Honor recipient she saved after his legs were blown off calls her a nurse. The Delta team she performed field surgery on while under direct enemy fire calls her a nurse. The man on that gurney, the Secretary of Defense, is alive right now because of that nurse. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more menacing than any shout. And you, what did you call her, Adrian? The ghost? You had a god of war in your ER, and you had her cleaning up your spilled coffee. The full, horrifying truth finally dawned on everyone. This wasn't just a nurse. This was a legend in disguise. The public humiliation of Dr. Adrian Thorne was not loud or explosive. It was a quiet, systematic, and utterly devastating dismantling. General Thorne did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were weapons, and he wielded them with surgical precision. "You were always a disappointment, Adrian," the general said, his voice low and conversational, yet it carried to every corner of the silent, cavernous room. The PJs were already working on Secretary Davenport, their movements swift and practiced, creating a bubble of competence around the gurney. The general's focus was entirely on his nephew. Always chasing the prestige, the title, the money. You never understood what it meant to serve, to sacrifice. Adrian's face had gone from white to a blotchy, mottled red. Sweat beaded on his forehead, plastering his perfect hair to his skin. I am a respected cardiologist," he stammered, falling back on his only defense. "I have credentials." "Your credentials?" The general let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "Let's talk about your credentials. Do you think I don't know that your father had to call in every favor he had to get you into Harvard after you barely scraped by in your undergrad? Do you think I forgot about the malpractice suit in your residency? The one in Boston, with the little girl who ended up with a permanent pacemaker because you misread her EKG? A suit that was quietly settled with a very large check from the Thorne Family Trust. A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the staff. Brenda's hand flew to her mouth. The sycophants who had laughed at Adrian's jokes just hours before now looked at him with a mixture of horror and dawning contempt. His entire persona, the bedrock of his authority, was being pulverized before their eyes. "You are not a healer, Adrian," the general continued, his voice relentless. "You are a brand, a well-marketed product with a hollow core. You stand here in your expensive suit in this temple of medicine, and you are a fraud. Today, your arrogance nearly cost this country its Secretary of Defense. Your incompetence nearly cost a good man his life." He gestured with his chin toward Alara, who was now directing the PJs, pointing to the monitor. "See that woman? She has operated in blacked-out tents with sand blowing in her face. She has used her own blood for transfusions when the banks ran dry. She has held the hands of boys half her age and promised them they would see home, and then moved heaven and earth to keep that promise. She represents the very best of what it means to serve. And you are not fit to wipe the mud from her boots." The general straightened up, his towering presence seeming to shrink Adrian until he was nothing. He turned to the pale-faced hospital administrator, Henderson, who looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Director Henderson," the general's voice was now formal, commanding. "Colonel Vance was forced to act today because your chain of command is rotten at the top. She saved a life in spite of your chief physician, not because of him. I trust you and your board will conduct a thorough review of Dr. Thorne's actions and his qualifications. The Department of Defense will, of course, be taking a very keen interest in the outcome of that review." It was a threat, wrapped in the language of bureaucracy, and everyone knew it. "And as for you," he said, turning back to Adrian for the last time. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked weary, disgusted. He nodded toward the two hospital security guards who were still standing by, looking utterly lost. "Gentlemen, I believe Dr. Thorne mentioned something about an assault. He's correct. He assaulted his responsibilities, his oath, and the trust of his patients. I'm sure Director Henderson will tell you where to escort him." Adrian Thorne made a sound, a choked, whimpering noise in the back of his throat. His legs seemed to give way, and he stumbled back against the counter, sliding down to the floor in a heap of expensive, ruined tailoring. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was just a broken, pathetic man, stripped bare in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. The ghost he had tried to exorcise had, in the end, become the reaper of his career. With Adrian Thorne, a crumpled mess on the floor, and the stunned silence of the ER staff as a backdrop, the scene at the gurney transformed. It was no longer a chaotic emergency. It was a high-stakes, high-precision military operation. Colonel Elara Vance was in her element. The quiet, hesitant demeanor was gone, burned away to reveal the core of pure, unyielding command. "Let's get him on the portable vent. I need a systolic over 90 for transport," she ordered, her voice clear and absolute. The PJs, two highly trained combat medics in their own right, responded instantly, their movements a seamless extension of her commands. They didn't question her. They trusted her implicitly. They had likely heard the stories of the Valkyrie long before they ever met her.
Pressure's dropping again, Colonel.
80 over palp, one of the PJs, a man with Raptor stenciled on his helmet, called out. "The Tamponade is back. He won't survive the flight without intervention," Elara stated, her mind working with terrifying speed. "We're doing the thoracotomy. Here. Now." General Thorne, who had been observing, stepped forward. "Valkyrie, are you sure? The flight surgeon is on the bird." "Sir, with respect, there's no time. His heart is being crushed. He has maybe 2 minutes," she countered, her gaze unwavering. It was the respectful but firm tone of a trusted field commander advising her general on tactical realities. The general held her gaze for a second, then gave a single, decisive nod. "Do it." What followed was a terrifying, beautiful, and brutal ballet of medical brilliance. "Ben!" Elara barked, and the young intern, who had been watching with an expression of slack-jawed awe, jumped. "Scalpel, 10 blade." Ben slapped it into her waiting hand. "Chloe, I need you to keep track of time and vitals. Call them out every 30 seconds. The young nurse, Chloe, her fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline, nodded, her eyes glued to the monitor. Elara made a long, sweeping incision from sternum to sternum, just below the pectoral muscles. It was not the delicate, precise cut of a planned surgery. It was a deep, powerful slash designed for speed. Blood welled up instantly. "Suction," she commanded, and one of the PJs was there with the tube. She cut through muscle and fascia until she reached the pale white of the ribcage. "Jiggly saw." Ben handed her the flexible, serrated wire saw. With practiced efficiency, Elara and one of the PJs worked it under the sternum. Then, with a few quick, powerful pulls, they sawed through the bone. The sound, a wet, grating crunch, made several of the hospital staff recoil. It was a sound of controlled violence. "Rib spreaders," she ordered. Ben handed her the large, intimidating metal crank. She inserted the teeth of the spreader into the gap she had created and began to turn the handle. With a series of sickening cracks, The man's entire chest cavity was hinged open like a book, exposing the thoracic organs to the air. There it was, the heart, twitching feebly, encased in a bruised, swollen, and dark purple pericardial sac, stretched taut with trapped blood. The rebar had pierced the upper edge of the sac, a wound that was still oozing. "Got it," Alara said. "Scissors." With delicate snips, she opened the pericardial sac. A gush of dark, pent-up blood and clots spilled out into the chest cavity. "Suction!" she commanded again. As the blood was cleared, the heart, suddenly freed from the suffocating pressure, gave a powerful lurch. It began to beat with a stronger, more regular rhythm. On the monitor, Chloe's voice rose with excitement. "BP is coming up, 100/60, heart rate stabilizing at 95. Alara found the bleeder on the surface of the heart, a small tear in the right atrium. With a fine needle driver and suture material from the PJ's pack, she placed 3 quick, perfect stitches, sealing the wound. The bleeding stopped. "He's stable for transport," she declared, her work done. The entire procedure had taken less than 90 seconds. The PJs moved with renewed urgency, securing the now open chest with sterile dressings, connecting their own advanced monitors, and preparing the gurney for the rough journey to the helicopter. General Thorne put a heavy hand on Alara's shoulder. His face was etched with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. "Thank you, Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You just saved a good man." Alara simply nodded, her adrenaline starting to fade, leaving a deep, familiar weariness in its place. As the PJs began to wheel the gurney out, she caught Chloe's eye. The young nurse was staring at her, her expression one of pure, unadulterated hero worship. Alara offered her a small, tired smile and a slight nod, a passing of the torch, a gesture of encouragement. She followed the team out into the lashing rain of the ambulance bay. The noise from the Pave Hawk was a physical blow. As she prepared to board the helicopter to accompany the patient, she took one last look back at the St. Jude's ER. The staff stood clustered at the doors, their faces illuminated by the strobing lights of the chopper. They looked like ghosts, pale and stunned, inhabitants of a world she had just left behind, forever. The helicopter lifted off, its ascent powerful and sure, leaving the broken, silent hospital in the storm below. 1 month later, the St. Jude's ER was a different place. The air, once thick with arrogance and fear, now held a quiet current of humility and diligence. Dr. Adrian Thorne was gone. A formal hospital board review, spurred by a quiet but firm inquiry from the Department of Defense, had resulted in the immediate suspension of his privileges. The subsequent investigation into his past, including the newly unearthed malpractice case from his residency, led to the permanent revocation of his medical license. The last anyone had heard, he was facing a barrage of lawsuits and had become a recluse in his family's mansion, a pariah in the community he had once dominated. In the ER, a new protocol was laminated and posted by every nursing station. It was called the Vance Protocol. It outlined a clear procedure for junior staff to challenge a senior physician's diagnosis in a critical, time-sensitive situation without fear of reprisal. It empowered people like Ben and Chloe, who now moved with a newfound confidence. Chloe, in particular, had become a fierce advocate for the protocol, often teaching it to new interns with a story about a quiet nurse who saved a life by refusing to be silent. The ghost had become a legend, a cautionary tale against arrogance and a symbol of hidden strength. Alara Vance was not there to see it. She never returned to St. Jude's. After Secretary Davenport made a full and miraculous recovery, publicly crediting the anonymous hero in the ER for saving his life, General Thorne had personally offered her any position she wanted. Head of Trauma at Walter Reed, a lucrative private research grant, a quiet, comfortable desk job at the Pentagon. She turned them all down. Her new home was a world away from the polished floors of St. Jude's or Walter Reed. It was a sprawling, state-of-the-art training facility in the dusty plains of Texas, known simply as the Crucible. It was here that the next generation of combat medics, PJs, and Special Forces surgeons were forged. Colonel Elara Vance stood on a platform overlooking a vast simulation room. Below her, a team of young medics worked frantically on a high-fidelity mannequin, its limbs mangled, its chest spurting fake blood, while speakers blasted the sounds of gunfire and explosions. She wasn't wearing faded scrubs anymore. She wore a crisp, functional military uniform, the silver eagle of a colonel gleaming on her collar. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes, once perpetually tired, were sharp and alive. She watched the team leader, a young sergeant, miss a key sign of a collapsed lung. She let him struggle for another 10 seconds, then her voice cut through the simulated chaos, crisp and commanding over the comms system. "Sergeant, check your patient's breath sounds. Your man can't breathe. What are you going to do?" The sergeant, flustered, realized his mistake and immediately reached for a decompression needle. Elara nodded to herself. They would learn. They would make mistakes here, so they wouldn't make them out there. After the simulation ended, she walked among the recruits, her limp barely noticeable. She corrected their technique, answered their questions, and instilled in them the brutal calculus of her trade. Competence above all. Later, in the quiet of her small, Spartan office, she opened a locked case. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a small collection of medals she never wore, and a single, worn silver pin in the shape of a winged woman carrying a sword. A Valkyrie. It was a gift from the first soldier she had ever saved, so many years ago. She picked it up, the cool metal a familiar weight in her hand. She thought of the arrogant doctor, the frightened nurses, the chaos of that night. She had not sought validation or revenge. She had simply done her duty. Her war was not over. It had just changed locations. Her purpose had never been to be recognized by the world she had left behind, but to protect the one she had sworn to serve. Looking out the window at the determined young faces on the training field, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. True heroes don't seek the spotlight. They are the ones who run toward the darkness, ready to pull others back into the light. And there is a hero like her, quiet and unseen, in a hospital, a classroom, or a uniform near you. You just have to have the wisdom to see them.